Hello, Year 9. I know a lot of you have been looking forward to learning about Jack the Ripper and the Whitechapel murders in 1888, and I thought now was as good a time as any for us to start to learn about them. So in today's lesson, if we look at those learning objectives, I want us to understand what problems people faced in Whitechapel at the time of the Ripper murders, and also understand the tension in Whitechapel. Understanding the background of Whitechapel help us understand just exactly how Jack the Ripper got away with his murders a bit more, and the problems the police faced. Before we go on, I just want to say thank you to the hard work you produced last week, and I want you to know your work is going to be rewarded. So moving forward, this is what we're going to do. If you submit work that's to a good standard, but it's late for whatever reason, we'll give you a merit. If you submit work to a good standard, and it's done on time, it meets the deadline, we'll give you 2 merits. And we'll give you an extra merit for completing dirt tasks if they are set. You might have received some last week and completed again to a good time when your teacher asks. Essentially, we're just keeping the merit system. We can add these totals to the back of your book when we come back to school, and the merit reward list will be in Google Classroom so you can see what you can cash those merits in for. So today's lesson, I've made it quite easy for you guys. I'm just doing 3 quizzes and that's it at different points this lesson. Now you should have those in Google Classrooms. Please can you make sure you open up the quizzes when I say so, after I've given a bit of information. Please make sure you read the question properly. I don't want you to drop marks just because you rushed reading a question. And can you make sure all 3 quizzes are submitted to your teacher by Sunday, the 3rd of May at 5 p.m. so we can see what your scores are, see if there's any problems there we need to address in future lessons. So, where is Whitechapel? Well, Whitechapel is in the East End of London. And obviously, being near London, it's quite close to Stopsley, as you can see there, Luton in the top left-hand corner, and Whitechapel shown in the bottom right. Now, London at this time was one of the most wealthiest capital cities in the world. You must remember that Britain controlled 1/3 of the world at this time. And so this is the capital city of that empire. And yet, despite a lot of London being wealthy, Whitechapel was very, very poor. And there were several problems that we're going to talk about. Problem 1 was pollution and poor sanitation. The fact is that Whitechapel was just covered in smoke. It was covered in gas fumes. You had these factories which people didn't really want too many of in the main part of London, so they shoved them to Whitechapel, the poorest area. There were businesses that would cause stench, like slaughterhouses and breweries as well. And the smoke that would come out of these chimneys, both at home and in factories, would mean sometimes it was just like a thick fog. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Now, this wasn't pollution like we've got today with car fumes, for example, but this was just from the sheer industrial revolution, and it made a perfect setting for crime to take place, because you could commit a crime and get away with it. There was also an issue with poor sanitation. Sorry for the graphic picture. But you had little healthy drinking water. The sewers would overrun into the streets. And obviously this water was quite deadly to a lot of people in Whitechapel. And if you want a statistic to back this up, you had 55% of children died before they reached the age of 5. Whitechapel was not a safe area to live in at all. Problem 2 was the overcrowded housing. Because despite the dangers of Whitechapel, despite the pollution that you had, people still wanted to go there. Well, not want, but they couldn't afford to go anywhere else. So where do you put all these people? Because Whitechapel was only a small part of London. Well, there were different solutions. One of these was Rookeries, which is where you would basically divide a house up with rooms holding a certain amount of people. So, for example, it'd be common to have a house where each room in the house would hold about 8 to 9 people. Now, if you've ever shared a room with a sibling before, you will know what a nightmare it is sharing with people, let alone not just one person, but actually 8 to 9. Some of the larger rooms in Whitechapel have been recorded to hold 30 people in one room. And as a result, as you can imagine, there was no privacy at all. Lots of families in the same room trying to live, trying to sleep. It would lead to overcrowding, arguments, diseases spreading through people coughing the whole time. It would be an absolute hell living in these places. You could try to move to a lodging house, which is where basically you were saying, look, I don't need a room, I literally just need a bed and that's it. So lodging houses are places where you could rent a bed for roughly about 81p in today's money. And this was where you had beds packed together in the room. This was used on the rotation systems. The beds were never empty, which meant you'd have to get into a bed which someone else had just been sleeping in and sweating in and so on, which is absolutely disgusting. And these beds were not high quality. The mattress was made from straw and hay, which meant you had lice and you had bugs in. There's no privacy. You can see from this picture, there's no privacy at all. You've got heat, you've got rats, and you've got people coughing, you've got diseases spreading everywhere. But if you didn't have a family, you could try and stay in a lodging house instead if it was just you on your own. Now, there were about 200 lodging houses in Whitechapel at this time. They held about 8,000 people in total. And just one example on records is that they held 757 people in 123 rooms. So you can see the people of Whitechapel are poor and they are often packed all together. They don't have their own private house. They can't afford it. Now, this clearly caused issues for the accommodation in Whitechapel, and the government and the councils tried to fix this. One example of this at the time was the Peabody Estate, which is where they knocked down some of the slum housing that we've just seen, and they built a lovely property, 286 flats on offer at affordable rent prices, and they said, right, we've done our best here. And it was nice. It was a good effort. The problem is that clearly this doesn't hold everyone. This is fantastic for 286 families. But for everyone else who couldn't get a flat here or couldn't afford a flat here, this didn't solve anything. This building was the exception to the problems in Whitechapel at the time. Problem 3, working conditions. Now, because there were so many people packed together in Whitechapel, there was not enough work to go around. And as more and more people come to Whitechapel, that problem only increases. The work that was available was often not nice work at all. It was hard, it was dangerous, and it was uncomfortable. An example of that could be seen with the sweatshops, where we can see in this picture people were forced to work in uncomfortable conditions, long hour, low pay, making basic things like matches and clothes. It would have been dusty, it had been cramped. Again, this is where you can see diseases spreading the whole time. Very poor light, just horrible working conditions, but people were desperate for money. You could try to find work as a labourer instead. There was some railway construction going on at the time. There was some work on the docks, unloading boats as they came in, so you could work as a docker. But again, pay was low and the amount of work varied each day. So you're not getting a lot of money, and you might not get money at all. There was not enough money for everyone. There was not enough work for everyone. Therefore, you might turn up, ask for work, and it had all been taken for the day. Work and money were both inconsistent. And again, we can see here a picture of the dockers there, so we get the idea of just a sort of physical labour work that would be done. And as a result, you wouldn't often see women doing this sort of work. It often tended to be men. That caused problems for women that we're going to see in a minute. But that's enough of the first 3 problems. There are 4 more we're going to look at in a minute. But first of all, let's just do quiz 1. It's attached to Google Classrooms. Make sure you've got the correct quiz. Please read the questions properly and submit your score. Pause the video here to do that, and then press play to continue once it's done. Okay, moving on. So, problem 4, workhouses and orphanages. Now, there were some people in Whitechapel who just had nothing. They had no money, they had no housing, there was literally nowhere for them to go. And the governments had to do something for these people. The workhouses were designed as a last resort when you've got nowhere else to go at all. And you would go to these buildings and you were given food and you were given a bed, but you had to do tough manual labour and you had to wear a uniform as well. And essentially, it's like a prison. The conditions were horrible. If you went with a family, you didn't stay as a family. You were split up. You could only see each other on Sunday and that's it. If you tried to communicate with each other at any time, there were harsh punishments. If you didn't work hard, harsh punishments. The food was always the same. And things could happen to you, like you'd be locked up for a day, there could be no food for a day, you could be whipped. And basically, the workhouses were like a prison for these poor people. Orphanages. Dr. Bernardo realised the situation. There were lots of orphan children around in Whitechapel at the time, and he tried to do what he could to help this. Orphanages were set up called Bernardo Homes, and these are places where children would be treated more humanely than in the workhouse. But places were limited. There were a lot of orphans around in Whitechapel, and so sadly, some children still had to go to the workhouses as a result. Problem 5, prostitution. Now, I said earlier that men found a little bit more easier to get jobs than women, especially with labour work. It was hard for women. Men often got the jobs ahead of them, and sometimes women had children they had to provide for as well. And they needed a source of income. They didn't want to go to the workhouses. They wanted to keep their independence. And so that meant sometimes women would turn to prostitution in order to make money to survive. Now, the police estimated at the time that there were 1,200 people doing this in Whitechapel on a regular basis. But actually, it was probably even more than that, because some women would do this when they needed to, just to get enough money to survive. I want to stress this, prostitution really was for these women a last resort to survive. Many of them had to walk the streets on their own, and this made them vulnerable to rape and assault. And when we see Jack the Ripper's 5 victims were prostitutes, we get the idea here of the problems that they faced. It wasn't just working the streets, it was also the problem of no contraception at the time and abortion being illegal. That meant that illegal abortions had to be used if the prostitute or the woman, became pregnant, and these abortions were horrific. Women could die from infections as a result. And yet, despite the struggles of the working class women trying to survive, they were looked down upon by the middle and higher classes. They didn't seem to understand that women were doing this to survive. They seemed to think that women enjoyed doing this. But it's telling that many prostitutes charged for their services about 81p, which, as we saw earlier, is the same as a bed in a lodging house. These are people doing this just to survive. Problem 6. Alcohol. So, for many, the life in Whitechapel was so bad that alcohol was seen as the only escape they had from their terrible problems. And it didn't help that alcohol like gin and beer were easily accessible. Pubs were really common in Whitechapel at the time. And this would lead to violence and crime as a result of drinking. People needed to get the money for their alcohol to fund the drinking, and this created more issues for the police as a result. And finally, problem 7 of violence and crime. Crime was high because people were struggling to survive, and so that meant people turned to crime to get money. We've already seen the fact that it was difficult to get regular paid work. And violence was used to sort issues out rather than reporting them to local law authorities. People didn't trust the police, people were scared of gangs finding out that he'd reported them to the police. The fact that Whitechapel had dark alleyways as well, it made life so much easier for these criminals. There were gangs that would form what we call protection rackets. And this is where they would demand money from smaller businesses. They would say, this is a really nice market stall. If you give me money, I will make sure that this doesn't get damaged. If you own that market stall, you've got 2 options. Option 1 is you pay the gang that money, or option 2 is you don't pay the gang that money and then they just smash your market stall up. Also, your market stall could be targeted by more than one protection racket. You had multiple gangs. And there would be gangs fighting gangs to control the areas of Whitechapel here to assert their dominance. And like we said, people really complained about these gangs because they were scared of the consequences. And that made it so much more difficult for the police to find out what was going on with these gangs and who was responsible. People being too scared and the dark alleyways made this very difficult for policing. So, quiz 2, we've looked at the other 4 problems there, a total of 7. Use the information from the yellow slides for this quiz. Okay, it's only the yellow slides you need to know. Read the questions carefully again. Press pause here. Once you've submitted the quiz, press play to continue. Okay, finally, I wanted to talk about two immigration groups that came to Whitechapel during this time, which added to the tension. The first are the Irish immigrants. These were people that were looking for work. There was basically no work in Ireland at the time, and so they moved to London. Some of them were looking to go to America and they ran out of money, and so Whitechapel was the most affordable place for them. And they looked for work on the docks or the canals, as we saw earlier. Physical labour work. Now, locals felt threatened by this. The people of the East End felt threatened because they felt they were losing their jobs to the Irish as more and more of them came in. And the Irish were also not liked. They were seen to be drunk and violent, although in reality, pretty much everyone was in Whitechapel this time. Now, what made matters worse was there was a terrorist group called the Fenians who launched terrorist attacks to remove British control from Ireland. The Fenians were hoping to scare Britain, who controlled all of Ireland at the time, so that the British government would give Ireland its independence. And one example of this was in 1867, where a bombing by the group had taken place at Clerkenwell Prison. And that was just over a mile away from Whitechapel. You can see it there in that picture in the bottom right. So the prison was blown up, a terrorist attack. And the problem this caused was that all Irish immigrants were now viewed suspiciously in Whitechapel. They were all seen as possible terrorists, even though it was really only a very small minority indeed that were a part of the Fenians. And the second of our two groups were the Jewish immigrants. Now, many Jews fled East Europe because they were being persecuted. They were being targeted, they were being killed in places like Russia and Poland. And as they moved across Europe, a lot of them settled in Whitechapel, in what we call self-segregated communities. This means that they kept themselves to themselves. This means that they stayed together. They didn't really integrate. They didn't really mix in with other members of East London at the time. And this can be seen with the fact that often the Jews in Whitechapel had their own language, clothes and customs. They seemed different to the locals. They would stand out from the regular members of the East End public, and this would create suspicion as a result. They didn't trust their ways. And tension was added because the immigrants also seemed to find work very easily. There would be people in the East End who'd be struggling every single day to get jobs, and they would find it frustrating when new arrivals would get work before them. You sometimes had the case where Jews would hire other Jews from their home country to work in places like sweatshops, for example, and that only increased the resentment between the locals and the Jews. Jewish sweatshops could make products that were cheaper for people to buy. This generated them more money and would undercut local businesses, which increased the tension. The people in Whitechapel didn't seem to understand that these poor Jews didn't necessarily want to live in Whitechapel. They'd wanted to live back home in Russia and Poland, but had escaped for their lives. They didn't understand the global context of the situation. And so, that's the information you need on the green slide to complete your final quiz. That's again attached to Google Classrooms. Please read the questions carefully. And once it's done, press pause here, press play to continue to finish this lesson. And that's it for today. So make sure those 3 completed quizzes are submitted by Sunday the 3rd of May at 5 p.m. Any feedback, email me at gbrown@stopseyhighschool.co.uk. And the next lesson for you guys will be up on Wednesday the 6th of May, where we're actually going to look at the murders themselves of Jack the Ripper. Guys, have a great day. Thank you for your hard work. Try and stay safe where possible. Get outside, get some fresh air, and I'll see you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.